Hey guys, so welcome to episode 2 of the show. I'm quite excited about today's episode. We've got 3 different parts to the show, or segments. So in segment 1, we're going to continue our discussion around the majestic bloodline side of it. We're going to be introducing into the first of our Spaniards. Remember we said we were going to name the pairs in our bloodline under different sort of royal sort of names and that, depending on whether it's a redhead, blackhead or orange head. So the orange heads are the Spaniards, and therefore we're going to use the Spanish monarchs' names for that segment. Anyway, then in segment 2 of the show, we're going to be looking at our spy cam. We hooked up an endoscope to a bird bath, and we sort of swapped it between different cages and just brought you some of that footage. And you know, whenever we capture something interesting with the spy cam, we'll definitely bring that to you. And then the final sort of segment of the show in this week is going to be the setting up of a box cage, and I specifically take you around my thinking in terms of perch placement, feeders, drinkers, that kind of thing, and how I go about it and what my sort of logic is behind that. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Please, at the end of the sort of show, please, if you don't mind commenting, it's just that feedback will give me sort of direction in terms of what you're finding interesting, what you'd like to see more of, that kind of thing, and that way we can sort of shape the show into something that's really going to be beneficial to everyone. So yeah, enjoy. Hey guys, welcome to the next sort of installment of the majestic bloodline side of things. So today we're going to be introducing you to Josephine and Odo, as mentioned earlier. But before we get there, I wanted to sort of chat to you about a little bit more behind the thinking of why we do stud breeding or developing our own sort of standard or model, if you like, over time. So what are we actually trying to achieve? Well, we mentioned in last week's episode that we're looking for consistency on the show bench. But over and above that, we're looking to breed to the type or model that I'm going to put up now on my left. And that is the South African type or model. So bear in mind, you obviously need to find your own type of model for the country that you live in. And that you will get by being part of a club and being involved in the show scene. And that model gives you your goal in terms of quality. Okay, so we're looking, in other words, by breeding a stud, we're looking to produce consistency, and we're looking to breed quality birds that are good enough for the show bench because they're comparable to the show standard or model in the country. So that's the primary benefit. But there's also a third benefit if you're breeding a stud of normals specifically. And that benefit is all around having something that is strong, or genetically strong, should I say, to breed back to any new mutation that you happen to be trying to develop. Now, why not just breed that mutation to as many different mutations as possible and produce as many color combinations? That is what a lot of the guys do. But it's questionable. And I'll tell you why it's questionable, is that when a mutation is developed, the guys will then inbreed, and there's a difference between breeding a stud line and inbreeding. They're very close, but the difference is a little bit of ethics and how closely you breed them back. So typically, someone trying to breed or establish a new mutation is going to try and replicate that mutation as quickly as possible. So they're going to do things like breeding sibling to sibling, so brother to sister, in other words. They're going to, well, it's less of a problem, but they're going to breed daughter to father, son to mother, that kind of stuff. And that in itself is not an issue, but when you do it too regularly, you then end up weakening the mutation. So in South Africa, the blue mutation is a classic example. The guys established it quickly and they inbred it. It was a recessive, so they were breeding sibs to sibs, that kind of stuff. And it resulted in a bird that is genetically quite weak. So to give you an idea of how weak, one of our club members, he's a very successful breeder. He bred 150 birds this year. And out of that, 20 of them were blues. Out of the blues, he's got 2 that survived to adulthood. 10% survival rate. So it tells you that there's a major problem with the mutation, the blue mutation in South Africa in terms of its strength. Overseas, it's a bit less of a problem, I believe. They're not weak, but in South Africa, it was one of the examples where mutation was bred incorrectly when it was established. And yes, they established the color, but at the sacrifice, or by sacrificing the health of the bird, which is a bad thing. So inbreeding to that level is bad. And what we're trying to achieve with our stud is to build up a really solid foundation that we can use for our mutation breeding. So we want it to be genetically strong. So it doesn't help if we're inbreeding all the time to a point of weakening the bird. Then we're doing the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. We're wanting that consistency, we're wanting that quality. And we're wanting to be sure that there's none of those mutations that may have been inbred in the past, so that we know we've got a healthy sort of start to any project. We can then take those purebred lines that are the correct type and model that we're wanting, and we can then utilize them with our mutation, because now we know we won't be breeding mutation back on mutation and producing therefore hopefully a stronger bird, and establishing our mutations in the ethically responsible way. And for me, I would rather leave a legacy of a really strong bird when I've bred a mutation, but it takes a little bit longer, so I've got to be a little bit more patient for any financial reward from that mutation than rushing after the money. You know, I'm never going to take a mutation like, for example, a pied, and now go and breed it to blue straight away as my first pairing, because I will produce a bird that is just failing in terms of its ability for long-term survival. It's not the right thing to do. Let's put it that way. All right, so enough of that. We've got sort of more idea of why we're wanting to do it, the pros and cons, and what we need to be careful of. In other words, the pitfalls of that. The other pitfall that I didn't mention, sorry, just before we move on, is just that the other danger of sort of line breeding is that you can often bring out the faults even though you're trying to eliminate them and breed for better quality. Okay, so let's move on and look at Odo. So Odo is a orange-headed purple-breasted greenback from the house of Gouldian. There's some pros and cons with Odo. In terms of his head shape, it's not quite as well-rounded as I perhaps would have liked, but it's not terrible either. I've seen many more examples of flat-headed birds that are worse than him. He's not flat-headed, but he's not as rounded as we would like. He does have good shape though, in terms of his posture on the perch, and he's got the line that we're looking for most of the time at the moment. Unfortunately, they are at the end of a breeding season, so their feather quality is shocking, and as a result they've got lumps and bumps where they perhaps shouldn't have because of missing feathers and that kind of thing. But as a general rule, his shape isn't bad. He's a little bit more elongated than I would have liked in terms of the roundness of the belly. However, there's a lot of really good strong points going for him. So we've discussed some of his negatives. Shame the guy's been knocked a bit, but on the positive side, he produces really good size offspring. The combination with his hen and himself, they really do produce good quality in terms of size. And both the hen and the cock, as in Odo and Josephine, they were rung as Derby rung birds by the house of Gouldian. So what that tells me about them is that their parents were particularly good quality, and the breeder was, because the way the Derby works is that you have a limited number of rings and you've got to pick a bird from each clutch that you think could be a contender to win the Derby portion of a show. So it's kind of like a lucky draw almost, that you don't know what you're going to get because you're ringing the chick as a baby. So therefore you have to look at the parents to get a feel for what type of quality and type you're going to get. So the fact that both hen and cock came from Derby run birds tells me that their parents were really superb birds. So even though they may have the odd unideal characteristics, they've got a lot of good points, and they come from extremely good lines, if you like. And we can see that in their offspring. Their offspring, they've got good beak shape, they've got good size, and I have no doubt that once they're coloured up, they're going to be really awesome quality birds. They have bred 4 youngsters for me in the second round, which was the final round now that we've just finished, and those are the ones still flying in the cage. And then they've also given me 3 from their first round, which are starting to colour up already. And already I can see the brightness from Odo, the father, is coming through in the suns. They're really nice, bright, spectacular purple. And the yellows are really rich. In fact, the one in the photo yesterday, or at least when it was bathing yesterday, it almost looked orange. It's so intense, the yellow. So, you know, from a color perspective, they're fantastic birds. All right, so now moving on to the hen. So Josephine in particular, once again, she's a substantial bird. On the perch, she's a decent size. She's got reasonably good posture on the perch. Her chest or belly isn't bad in terms of shape at all. She's got the right sort of backline, and her head's not bad. At the moment, she is missing feathers, so there's a divot out of the back of her head just behind the mask, the colour portion of the head. But that's a time of year issue. The cockbird pulls the odd feather out during the mating process, and that's why she's got those couple of feathers missing. It's not many, but it is a few, and it's enough to cause that sort of kink at the back of the head. But it's not a genetic thing. It's purely the time of year. So yeah, she's a really nice bird. Yeah, she's definitely the kind of shape that we're looking for in our stud. And yeah, I think the pairing has been very good for us. Obviously, we won't know until the offspring are fully coloured up whether we're going to then repair them or we're going to split the pair and start breeding them to other of our orange purple breasted line. But we will know that in about another month's time or so when the chicks are fully coloured and we've got a couple of the other of the incoming birds, so we know exactly where we are in terms of the bloodline. So moving on to the next segment of the show, it's our new segment, which is a spy cam segment, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to another education segment of the show. Well, this week's segment, I thought we would look at how we set up the box cages for the birds. In this particular case, I use for my bird room, should I say, I use a 76 centimeter long cage by 45 by 45 high. They are all wire cages, but remember my cages fit into a cabinet, so it's essentially surrounded on all sides except for the front edge. So the birds feel quite secure in this cage. I wouldn't recommend a completely open cage necessarily. For the Gouldians, they do feel like to have that little bit of protection, if you like, or shelter. So yeah, basically the way this cage comes from the supplier is that it's meant to have these 2 long perches, one in the front and one in the back. The problem that I have with that type of setup is that by the time you take a little bit of space for the front and the back, it really doesn't leave the birds as much flying room, because the gap between the perches is only about 30 centimeters apart. So I prefer a setup where the perches are on opposite side of the cages, like I've done here. So my first perch I put in is this one, which goes across the full length, at least width of the cage, or depth of the cage, whatever you want to say. And that's the thickest perch in this particular case. And I say the thickest perch, I prefer to have 3 different perch thicknesses. And the reason I do that is so that the bird's feet get maximum exercise as it lands on each different size perch. So for me, that's quite important that you change the perch sizes. Okay, so the reason for the placement of this one is that it's far enough away from the side of the cage that even your cockbird with a longer tail is not messing up his tail on the side of the cage. Particularly your show birds, you don't want to have their tails messed up for the show, because that will count against them. The next thing that I do is you'll notice that it's quite a far distance from the roof of the cage. Mine's roughly on the halfway mark, and the reason being is that by the time you take the height of the bird, and then the cockbirds, when they're courting the hens, they're bobbing up and down, so you're wanting to give them that headroom so they're not banging their heads on the top of the cage. So that's quite important, and that's why I nicknamed this the courtship perch. My food bowls then go, or seed dish goes directly below this perch. Now normally you don't put food bowls below a perch, but in my case, because this is an external type and they put their head in to eat, it's all covered, there's no chance that they can mess in their seed bowl. So there's no risk the way I set it up in terms of that. All right, so that's this side of the cage. I then put in 2 diagonal perches, one across the front corner and one across the back corner. This diagonal perch is the access perch for their water. So this is the water fountains I use. It's got the spout that goes into the cage, and I rest that on the actual perch itself. So the perch is below, and therefore, once again, the birds can't sit on the perch and mess in their water. Okay, that same access perch then allows space for them to access their soft food. So the soft food dish will then also clip in on that side of the cage, and the birds can land on the perch, see what you've brought them in terms of treats, and then hop on the actual feeder to sit and eat. So that's how I do that feeding perch, if you like. And then the roosting perch across the back corner, I put that as high as possible, but obviously allowing enough height for the bird. And the reason I do that, remember, my cages are enclosed, so the birds really feel safe at night. They're tucked away in the corner right at the top, as high as they can possibly be, and it makes them feel as safe as possible. So that works really well as the roosting perch. Now, this flap over here is where I've cut a hole in the cage to fit my nest boxes on. You might say, oh, but what about the nest box perch that's directly above your water fountain? These water fountains have quite a narrow spout. So my nest boxes have quite a thick perch on them, and that thickness happens to be the same thickness as my fountain. That plus the fact that the bird's vent is a good sort of centimeter away from where the perch would be when they perched, their droppings would then fall essentially past the drinker on either side. And in the 3-4 years I've used this exact layout, I've never had an issue with droppings in my water fountain. So that works really well for me. And the last thing that I like about this particular layout is the fact that it leaves this door completely open. So if I do need to put my hands in to catch a bird, I can access it through the front door. If I want to clip on a bath, I can do that, and it leaves the maximum flight space for the birds because the perches are off to the sides on the length of the cage. So I'm making maximum use of the cage and giving the birds maximum flight benefit. So the birds would then fly from the lowest perch to this perch and up again, which is in an upward trajectory. Once again, it's all about giving them maximum exercise and making them work as hard as possible when they're flying around and keeping them nice and fit. The final point that I'd like to mention with these particular cages is that the sides can actually open up. And what I do, and you would have seen it from episode 1, that I had 2 of the cages joined, and then I put some zip ties on just to make sure that they don't come apart. And that then becomes a double cage, which is 1.5 meters long, or just short of it. And that's a nice long flight cage for youngsters that are fully weaned, or alternatively in the off season when I'm not breeding, I put all my hens in one, I put all my cocks in one, and that way they've got loads of exercise space during the non-breeding season. So yeah, that works really well for me, and yeah, that's about it. Hey guys, so I hope you enjoyed the episode today. Next week we're going to be starting to look at some of the mutations and what the plans are for those. And then also if I could have some feedback in the comment section just with regards to what you're thinking of the episode so far, which features you like, which features you maybe think we could do a bit differently. Please, any constructive criticism would really be appreciated so that we can make the show as beneficial to everyone as possible. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it and we'll see you for the next episode.